Hey guys, today we're in Leviticus chapter 17. Now remember, we've talked about the sacrifices, the priest, purity, and now 16 and 17 go together talking about the Day of Atonement. Now as you read chapter 17, you're probably thinking it doesn't talk about the Day of Atonement. Well, necessarily doesn't mention it, but it tells us why it is important. The blood. It's all about the blood that gives the covering of the sin. And so we see in chapter 17, we get some rules and some regulations about blood and why it's important. Notice it says, verse 3, if anyone in the house of Israel kills an ox, a lamb, a goat in the camp, or kills it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to offer it as a gift to the Lord in front of the tabernacle of the Lord, blood guilt shall be imputed to that man. Now, when it gives that list, an ox, a lamb, a goat, it's not just talking about slaughtering. They didn't have to take every single animal to the tabernacle, but it's talking about that when you were to sacrifice. See, in these days, it was normal for anybody to sacrifice wherever they wanted. And a lot of people sacrificed on high places, on top of mountains, on big hills, somewhere that was elevated, meaning they were closer to God. But here, God is doing something important. And it's something that really a lot of people don't think is important today, but it is. And it's called the centrality of worship. God is bringing all of Israel, 2 million people plus, together and says, when you worship God at one place. Right? Remember, the whole point of what God is doing is that He would be their people and they would be His people, right? They will know, the world will know that they are different. Well, how is this? They're bringing worship to one place. And so basically says, hey, you can't worship somebody, you can't sacrifice on a hill, you can't sacrifice in the woods, you can't sacrifice there or there. When you come to meet God, you come to meet Him at the place of God, right? At the tabernacle, at the tent of meeting. And it says, and if you don't, what happens? The blood guilt shall be imputed to the man. If you sacrifice and you worship in a different way than what God says, then you are in sin. God is giving them very strict specifications on how to worship Him. Anything other than that is a sin. And it's not just because God is just wants to make a bunch of rules, but God is separating His people from the rest of the people on the earth. Right? Remember when we were teenagers, we would say, well, if your friends would tell you to jump off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge? Well, that's what God is doing here. Everybody else is jumping off the bridge, and God is saying, no. We're not going to worship me by jumping off the bridge. You're going to worship me at a particular place, in a particular manner, in a particular style, at a particular time, right? God is separating Israel from the rest of the world. But if they worship wrong, so if they choose to sacrifice in a different manner, that means they are not worshiping Yahweh. They are not listening to God. They are living in sin. And so because of that, what happens? Verse 4, they shall be cut off. They shall be excommunicated. They're kicked out of the camp. They're kicked out of Israel forever. And so that's telling you how important this is to God. It goes on in verse 5, and it says, this is the end, that people of Israel may bring sacrifices. They sacrifice in an open field, bring them to the Lord, bring them to the entrance of the tent of meeting. Centralized worship. Today, especially in America, especially in Western, I hear as a pastor all the time, well, I can worship God wherever I want. I don't have to go to church. The book of Leviticus, yes, it's the Old Testament. Yes, it's a part of the law, but God is drawing something together before the church was created that God's people should stay together. How do you worship God? You come together with like-minded people and you worship God. And so people say, well, I can worship God on a bass boat. I can worship God in a deer stand. I can worship God on a soccer field or in a stand watching my kid play baseball. Well, the truth is, can you worship God? Yes. But what is worshiping God in a tree stand? How is that different? What's different than goes on church? Being alone by yourself, that's not worship of God. We're called to be around people, to not forsake the gathering, right? And so here we're getting Old Testament imagery of something that is to come, that God's people should be together and they should be worshiping God together. They should be holding one another accountable, because as you sit in a tree stand on a bass boat or on a bleacher watching your kid play, you can say, yeah, you're worshiping God, but you're not dissecting the Word of God. You're not making other Christians' lives better by pouring into them. Your life is not being better by being poured in to other Christians. You're not singing and worshiping God no matter what's going on in your life, but you're surrounded with other Christians that are living life and singing and praising God for His glory and His goodness. You might say that you can worship God, but that's not what God had intended. So we see this from the very beginning, centralized worship. And he goes on and he talks about they come to the entrance of meetings, verse 7, so they shall no more sacrifice their sacrifices to goat demons after whom they whore. Now, when you read this, I know you got a question. What in the world is a goat demon? Well, when you read this in Hebrew, it truly is the word goat, right? In these days, and even way after these days, even into Rome, into Corinth, Ephesus, a lot of these places, people would worship goat. Goat was kind of the normal idol of its time. And so even today, if you were to look up something of Wicca or the occult, you see the sign of Satan looking like a goat, right? And so it's just a common thought. And so the word goat truly means a hairy one. It's what it really means. But when you're worshiping something that's not in God's standard and God's method, you're doing something against God. Therefore, you're doing something for Satan. There is only God. There is only Satan, right? And so a goat demon, an idol that is satanic. That's what it's referring to. So if you sacrifice other than what God said, you're worshiping Satan. You're living a life of sin. And it says, after whom they whore. This is an interesting word, right? The word of prostitution. And we're getting a picture here that will carry all the way throughout Israel's history, especially when we get into the prophets and the minor prophets, that we get a picture here that Israel is the covenant wife of Yahweh. Yahweh is the husband, Israel is the wife. And so the wife is prostituting, is always wanting to go after something else that is not her husband, not her groom, right? And so here we see that picture played out. And once again, if they do not sacrifice in the right way, verse 9, they shall be cut off. And then in verse 10, we start an interesting section about blood, which is kind of gross, but it's so important. If anyone in the house of Israel or stranger or sojourner eats any blood, I will set my face against the person who eats blood and will cut him off from among the people. Now, this is not talking about vampires, but this is talking about a pretty common practice that people would eat or drink blood of animals thinking that they're getting the life source, right? So think about for this, if your husband was going on a hunting trip and he's going up into the mountains, that he would drink the blood of a ram, because a ram is nimble in the mountains. So he would take on the powers of a ram while that ram's blood is inside of him, right? So you get the idea. Drinking the blood or eating the blood of animals or things could give them supernatural powers of that animal. And God knows That's stupidity. That's craziness. And so he says, whoever eats the blood, I will set my face against them. So whoever believes in this, they believe that God is not the real God, but they're worshiping other gods and trying to get power from other animals. He says, I will set my face. That means I will reject them. I will turn my back to them. They are no longer my people. And I will cut him off from the people. Once again, excommunicating, ridding them from Israel. Notice verse 11, for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. The point of blood is what gives life. Life is blood. Blood is life. And because God created life, all blood is to be given back to the Creator, back to God. So if mankind were to kill something so that he could drink that blood, he's taking the life from that animal in which God created, and he's not giving it back, right? So you get this idea of I'm just taking and never giving and giving. But notice what he says here. He says, I have given it to you on the altar. God has made a way for the taking of blood to give them something, right? So the taking of blood from an animal when poured on an altar to God is giving them something. It is giving them a connection with God. It is forgiving their sins in the Day of Atonement, the verse before. And then in verse 15, we simply get every person who eats of an animal that dies of itself, which naturally dies or is torn by beast, he can eat it, but he would become unclean, and he would need to ceremonially wash himself and wait till the evening, and then he would be clean again. But verse 16, but if he does not wash them or bathe his flesh, he shall bear his iniquity. If you don't do that, you will be unclean in perpetuality, right? You will remain that. So there's a standard that blood, flesh is very serious to God. Now, when you read this chapter, where is Jesus? Verse 11, we talked about it, but there's two messianic prophecies here in verse 11. One is the blood is the life of the flesh, right? Jesus sits with his disciples in the Last Supper, Matthew chapter 26, and he says, this blood is the blood of the new covenant. Mark chapter 10:45 speaks about his blood being what he bought us. He redeemed us back in that. And then also we see that the blood is what makes atonement. Romans chapter 3 verses 23 and 24, we've all fallen short of the glory of God, but it is through the blood that we can come back. 1 John 1-7, it is through the blood that Jesus redeems us. He buys us back, right? So we see this idea that the blood is what gives atonement. The blood is what makes us new. The blood is what gives us life. And so God is putting in Israel this mentality that blood is sacred. It is holy, and they shouldn't spoil it. They shouldn't waste it. But blood is what brings holiness. Blood is what brings redemption. Blood is what connects God and man. And we see that Jesus died on a cross, and through his blood he connected God and man once and for all, that all who would believe would be children of God. So I hope that makes sense. So you've had the priest, you have the sacrifices, the priests, the purity. Now you've had the Day of Atonement and the blood, chapters 16 and 17. And now the rest of the chapter, we walk back. We learn more about purity, then we learn more about priest, and then we end up learning more about sacrifices. So I hope this makes sense, and we'll see you tomorrow in chapter 18. God bless.